Elvis Presley was born in a two-room shack, his daddy built by hand. His identical twin brother died at birth. Young Elvis once brought a dead lizard to school in his pocket. Long before the jumpsuits and Graceland, the king of rock and roll was just a poor Mississippi boy, with big dreams and unusual habits that would shape music history forever. Elvis Aaron Presley's early years in Tupelo remain surprisingly mysterious to many fans who only know the glittering Las Vegas performer or the heartthrob movie star. But those formative childhood years held the key to understanding the man who would change American music forever. Number 10. Elvis was born during the Great Depression in a house that cost $180. The king of rock and roll began life in the humblest of circumstances. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was just 22 years old when he borrowed $180 from his employer to build a tiny wooden house for his pregnant wife, Gladys, in East Tupelo, Mississippi. The house, barely bigger than some modern walk-in closets, consisted of just two rooms, a bedroom and the kitchen. Elvis arrived during the darkest days of the Great Depression on January 8, 1935. The economic conditions in Mississippi were particularly dire, with many families struggling just to put food on the table. The Presleys were no exception. Vernon worked odd jobs whenever he could find them, but steady employment was nearly impossible to secure. The tiny house where Elvis was born had no electricity and no indoor plumbing. The family used oil lamps for light and had to fetch water from a well. During cold winter nights, they huddled around a small wood-burning stove that served as both their heat source and cooking appliance. Today, this humble birthplace has been preserved as a historical site. Thousands of Elvis fans make pilgrimages to see the tiny structure where the future king took his first breath. The contrast between this simple beginning and the opulence of Graceland couldn't be more striking. Elvis went from a house that cost less than $200 to build to a mansion worth millions, a true American rags to riches story. The poverty of his early years would leave a lasting impression on Elvis. Even after achieving enormous wealth and fame, friends noted that he never took money for granted and often seemed haunted by the fear of returning to poverty. He was known for his extraordinary generosity, spontaneously buying Cadillacs for strangers and giving away jewelry worth thousands. Some psychologists have suggested this behavior stemmed directly from those earliest years in the tiny Tupelo shack, when having nothing made him appreciate everything. Number 9. Elvis had identical twin brother who died at birth. Perhaps the most tragic fact about Elvis's birth is that he wasn't supposed to be an only child. Gladys Presley delivered identical twin boys on that cold January morning in 1935. Elvis Aaron Presley survived, but his brother, Jesse Garon Presley, was stillborn, delivered 35 minutes before Elvis. This loss cast a shadow over the Presley family. Gladys, in particular, was devastated by the death of one of her sons. Medical care in rural Mississippi during the Depression was minimal at best, and complications during childbirth were common. Jesse was buried in an unmarked grave in Priceville Cemetery, not far from the Presley home, as the family couldn't afford a proper headstone. Elvis grew up knowing about his twin, and throughout his life he was reportedly haunted by thoughts of Jesse. Some biographers have suggested that Elvis carried survivor's guilt throughout his life. He would sometimes speak to Jesse in moments of private reflection, imagining what his brother would say or how different life might have been with his twin by his side. Several of Elvis's close friends reported that the singer believed his tremendous success was somehow linked to having the life energy of two people. Elvis would occasionally make comments suggesting he felt he was living for both himself and Jesse. Psychologists have long studied the effects on surviving twins when one dies at birth. Many survivors report feeling a lifelong sense of something missing, a phantom presence they can't explain. Elvis reportedly told his girlfriend Ginger Alden shortly before his death, "The only thing that keeps me going is that I'm doing it for Jesse, too." The loss of his twin may have contributed to the intense bond between Elvis and his mother. Gladys became famously protective of her surviving son, perhaps fearing she might lose him too. This close mother-son relationship would profoundly shape Elvis's personality and emotional life well into adulthood. Number 8. Elvis nearly drowned in a creek when he was only 4 years old. Long before Elvis faced the dangerous currents of fame and fortune, he nearly lost his life in the rushing waters of Mud Creek near his Tupelo home. When Elvis was just 4 years old, he was playing near the creek after a heavy rainstorm had caused the normally gentle waters to swell into a dangerous torrent. While his mother was briefly distracted, young Elvis slipped on the muddy bank and fell headlong into the rushing water. Unable to swim and caught in the current, the future king was swept downstream as neighborhood children shouted for help. Vernon Presley heard the commotion and raced to the creek, diving in fully clothed. He managed to grab his son just before Elvis would have been pulled under a small bridge, a spot where the current was particularly treacherous. Vernon dragged his sputtering, terrified son to shore, likely saving his life. Gladys, already an anxious and protective mother due to losing Jesse at birth, became even more vigilant after this incident. She reportedly wouldn't allow Elvis near water without supervision for years afterward. Elvis himself developed a temporary fear of water that took several years to overcome. Interestingly, this brush with death occurred around the same time that Elvis was beginning to show his first interest in music. Some Tupelo old-timers later remembered that young Elvis seemed to become even more drawn to singing after his near drowning, as though the experience had awakened something in him. This incident remained vivid in Elvis's memory throughout his life. In a 1972 interview, he mentioned it briefly, saying, "I've had a guardian angel looking out for me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Nearly got washed away before I could even carry a tune." The creek still flows through Tupelo today, and visitors to Elvis's birthplace sometimes stop by the spot where the future king nearly met an early end. A small, unmarked bridge crosses the creek not far from where Elvis played as a child, a humble reminder of how easily music history might have been altered by one tragic afternoon. Number 7. Elvis's first public performance was standing on a chair in church at age 5. Before the gold records, before the screaming fans, before the motion pictures, Elvis's first taste of performing came standing on a chair in the Assembly of God Church in East Tupelo when he was just 5 years old. Too small to be seen by the congregation. Otherwise, young Elvis was hoisted onto a wooden chair by his proud mother so he could sing the gospel song, "Jesus Loves Me," to the gathered worshipers. The small wooden country church played a crucial role in developing Elvis's musical sensibilities. The Presley family attended services multiple times per week, and it was here that Elvis was first exposed to the passionate singing and emotional delivery that would later define his own performance style. Pastor Frank Smith, who led the congregation during Elvis's childhood, later recalled that the boy had an unusual intensity even then. "He didn't just sing the words," Smith said in a 1957 interview. "He felt them. You could see it in his face. Even as a little feller, most kids just parrot the songs. But Elvis, he put his whole self into it." After that first performance, Elvis became a regular participant in church singing. His mother Gladys, noticing his enthusiasm, encouraged him by singing duets with him at home and teaching him harmonies to gospel standards. The church congregation became Elvis's first audience, and their warm reception gave him his first taste of the approval that would later become so addictive on a much larger scale. The Assembly of God Church practiced a particularly emotional brand of Pentecostal worship, with congregants sometimes speaking in tongues, dancing in the Spirit, and expressing their religious fervor physically. Young Elvis absorbed these displays of ecstatic spirituality, and many music historians believe this early exposure to uninhibited emotional expression later influenced his dynamic performance style. Gospel music remained close to Elvis's heart throughout his career. Even at the height of his fame, he would often gather friends and band members to sing gospel songs for hours after shows. His 3 Grammy Awards were all for gospel recordings, not his rock and roll hits. That little church in Tupelo no longer stands, though a commemorative marker notes where it once was. But its influence resonates to every hip swivel and impassioned vocal performance that made Elvis the king of rock and roll. Number 6. Elvis brought a dead lizard to school in his pocket. Long before he collected Cadillacs and gold records, young Elvis had a peculiar collection habit that horrified his second-grade teacher. Elvis developed a fascination with small reptiles and amphibians that inhabited the woods and creeks around Tupelo. He would spend hours catching lizards, frogs, and small snakes, studying their movements and keeping them temporarily in jars before releasing them. One spring morning in 1943, 8-year-old Elvis arrived at East Tupelo Consolidated School with an unusual bulge in his pocket. During reading time, he proudly pulled out a green anal lizard, commonly called a chameleon by local children, to show his seatmate. Unfortunately, the lizard had not survived its journey to school in Elvis's pocket. His teacher, Miss Oletta Grimes, was startled when several girls screamed and a dead lizard suddenly appeared on her classroom floor. Elvis was sent to the principal's office for disrupting class, but instead of receiving punishment, something unexpected happened that would change his life. A principal, aware that it was near Elvis's birthday, asked if he would like to sing a song at the upcoming school assembly as a special treat. Elvis agreed, and performed Old Shep, a tearjerker about a boy and his dog. This performance, prompted by a disciplinary incident involving a dead lizard, was Elvis's first formal performance outside of church. Miss Grimes was in the audience for this performance and was so impressed by Elvis's natural talent that she mentioned it to Orville Bean, the school superintendent. This chain of events, set in motion by the unfortunate lizard, led to Elvis's first recognition as a uniquely gifted vocalist. Elvis's childhood interest in catching creatures never fully disappeared. Friends from his teenage years recall that he still occasionally caught snakes to frighten girls at Humes High School in Memphis. Even at Graceland, Elvis maintained exotic pets, including a monkey and peacocks, suggesting his childhood fascination with animals continued throughout his life. The school where the lizard incident occurred was demolished years ago, but Elvis's reputation as a nature-loving child with unusual hobbies lives on in Tupelo folklore. Local tour guides often point out areas where young Elvis might have caught his critters, connecting the king of rock and roll to the simple pleasures of a rural southern childhood. Number 5. Elvis was so poor. His classmates made fun of his homemade clothes. Throughout much of Elvis's childhood in Tupelo, the Presley family struggled with extreme poverty that affected every aspect of their lives, including young Elvis's wardrobe. Unlike most of his classmates who had store-bought clothing, Elvis often wore shirts and pants that Gladys had sewn herself from discarded fabric scraps and flour sacks. In the early 1940s, many families recycled flour and feed sacks into clothing, but by Elvis's school years this practice was becoming less common as post-Depression prosperity slowly returned to America. The homemade nature of Elvis's clothes made him stand out, and not in a way the sensitive boy appreciated. Classmates sometimes taunted Elvis about his appearance, calling him flour sack or feed bag. One particularly painful memory Elvis later shared with friends involved a Christmas pageant when he was 9. While other boys wore proper trousers, Elvis had to perform wearing pants Gladys had made from green curtain material, prompting whispers and snickers from other children. Teachers at East Tupelo Consolidated School noticed that Elvis was sometimes reluctant to participate in activities that would draw attention to his appearance. He would often hang back during playground games or position himself at the edges of class photos. This self-consciousness was a stark contrast to the confident performer he would later become. The experience of being mocked for his clothing left lasting impressions on Elvis. Throughout his adult life, he was known for his extravagant wardrobe and seemed almost obsessed with having an abundance of clothing options. The flashy jumpsuits, custom shoes, and designer outfits that defined his later image might be seen as a psychological response to those early years of wardrobe shame. Interestingly, when Elvis achieved fame and fortune, one of his first major purchases was an extensive wardrobe of high-end clothing. Friends reported that he became almost anxious if his closets weren't fully stocked with options. The boy who once had only 2 pairs of overalls eventually owned hundreds of custom-designed stage costumes, some costing the equivalent of what his father might have earned in several years during the Tupelo days. In a touching full-circle moment, when Elvis returned to Tupelo for a homecoming concert in 1956, he made sure to wear a dazzling gold lame suit that cost $2,500, an outfit specifically chosen, according to some biographers, to visually exorcise the ghosts of those childhood taunts about homemade clothes. Number 4. Elvis had a secret hideout in the woods where he would go to sing alone, away from the cramped confines of the family's small homes and the watchful eyes of his protective mother. Young Elvis discovered a private sanctuary in the woods near Tupelo's Gum Pond. Beginning around age 7, Elvis created a crude hideaway among a stand of sweet gum trees about a half-mile from his home, using discarded lumber and tin to fashion a simple lean-to shelter. This secret spot became Elvis's first studio, where he could experiment with his voice without anyone listening. According to childhood friends who occasionally joined him there, Elvis would bring along a beat-up guitar that belonged to his uncle and practice strumming while singing songs he'd heard on the radio or in church. Sam Bell, who grew up near the Presleys, later recalled, "Most of us boys had hideouts, but Elvis spent more time in his than anybody. Sometimes you could hear him singing from a quarter-mile away. He'd be in there just wailing away, not caring who might be listening, but if you walked up on him, he'd get shy real quick and stop." The hideout also doubled as Elvis's reading sanctuary. Though not particularly academically inclined, Elvis enjoyed comic books and adventure stories. Teachers noted he often seemed tired in school, and some speculated it was because he stayed in his woodland retreat, reading by flashlight late into the evening. This childhood habit of seeking solitude to practice music continued throughout Elvis's life. Even at the height of his fame, he would often retreat to private spaces to work on songs away from the pressure of producers and band members. Friends at Graceland noted that Elvis would sometimes spend hours alone in his bedroom suite working on vocal techniques. The location of Elvis's childhood hideaway is now part of a neighborhood development with no visible sign of the crude structure that once sheltered a future king. However, longtime Tupelo residents still occasionally point out the general area to especially curious Elvis tourists who venture beyond the official birthplace site. Perhaps most significantly, this early habit of musical solitude helped Elvis develop his unique sound away from too many outside influences. Without formal training and working by ear alone in his woodland sanctuary, he was free to blend the gospel singing from church with the country music from the radio and the blues he heard from black field workers, creating in isolation the distinctive vocal style that would eventually change American music forever. Number 3. Elvis's father went to prison when Elvis was only 3 years old. One of the most disruptive and formative events in young Elvis's life occurred when he was just 3 years old. His father, Vernon Presley, was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 3 years in prison for forgery, an event that dramatically altered the family dynamic and created financial hardship that would follow them for years. The incident involved Vernon and 2 other men altering a $4 check from Vernon's employer, landowner Orville Bean, changing it to $14. While the amount seems trivial by today's standards, in Depression-era Mississippi, such crimes were taken very seriously. Despite being a first-time offender, Vernon received what many considered a harsh sentence of 3 years at Mississippi's notorious Parchman Farm prison. With Vernon imprisoned, Gladys was forced to move from their home as she couldn't maintain the payments. Elvis and his mother moved in with relatives, beginning a period of transience that would see them living in at least 4 different locations during Vernon's incarceration. This instability left a deep impression on young Elvis, who later told friends he remembered the confusion of constantly changing homes. Gladys took work as a seamstress and occasionally cleaned houses to make ends meet, but the family sank deeper into poverty. Elvis sometimes accompanied his mother when she visited Vernon in prison, experiences that were traumatic for the young boy. The sight of his father in prison clothes behind bars was something Elvis rarely spoke about later in life, but friends suggested it had profound psychological effects. Vernon was released after serving 8 months of his sentence due to good behavior, but the stigma of being an ex-convict made finding steady work even more difficult than before. The family's financial situation continued to deteriorate, eventually contributing to their decision to leave Tupelo for Memphis when Elvis was 13. Years later, when Elvis achieved fame, he went to extraordinary lengths to protect and financially support his parents, particularly his father. Some biographers have suggested that Elvis's almost compulsive generosity toward Vernon stemmed from a desire to ensure his father never again felt the desperation that had led to the check forgery. Vernon's brief criminal history was carefully concealed during Elvis's early career, with Colonel Tom Parker orchestrating a public relations campaign to present the Presleys as a model American family. It wasn't until years after Elvis's death that many fans learned this surprising detail about the King's childhood. Number 2. Elvis's teacher thought he had no musical talent after his first guitar lesson. In a twist of irony that seems almost unbelievable given his later success, Elvis's first formal encounter with music education resulted in his teacher deciding he had absolutely no musical aptitude. When Elvis was 11 years old, Gladys scraped together enough money for him to take a proper guitar lesson from a local Tupelo musician named Frank Smith, no relation to the pastor of similar name. Smith was known around Tupelo for playing at square dances and local events. He agreed to give young Elvis a lesson for 50 cents, a considerable sum for the Presley family at that time. Elvis arrived, clutching his small guitar, excited to learn proper technique from a real musician. The lesson was a disaster. Smith tried to teach Elvis basic chord structures and proper finger positioning, but became frustrated when Elvis couldn't or wouldn't follow his instructions. After less than 30 minutes, Smith told Gladys not to waste any more money on lessons because her son ain't got an ear for music. According to Gladys's later recollections, Smith complained that Elvis wanted to strum along and sing rather than master proper guitar technique. "He just wants to make noise, not music," Smith reportedly told her. The critical assessment devastated young Elvis, who cried on the walk home. Despite this discouragement, Elvis continued teaching himself to play, developing his own unorthodox style that emphasized rhythm over technical proficiency. He learned by listening to the radio and watching other guitarists at church and local gatherings. His unique, self-taught approach would later become part of his signature sound, a style that professional musicians sometimes criticized, but audiences adored. Years later, when Elvis returned to Tupelo as a star for a 1956 homecoming concert, Smith approached him backstage and reintroduced himself. According to witnesses, Elvis smiled graciously and said, "Yes, sir, I remember you still working on those chord positions you showed me." Whether Elvis was being genuinely kind or subtly ironic remains one of those delicious mysteries of music history. This early rejection from a music authority figure established a pattern that would repeat throughout Elvis's career. Music industry professionals and classical musicians often dismissed his abilities, even as he was revolutionizing popular music. Elvis's lack of formal training, beginning with that single failed lesson in Tupelo, meant he never learned the rules of music that might have constrained his innovative approach. Number 1. Elvis performed as the Hillbilly Cat at age 10 and won $5 in a talent show. Perhaps the most prophetic event of Elvis's Tupelo childhood occurred just 3 years before the family moved to Memphis. At age 10, Elvis participated in a children's talent contest at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show held in Tupelo in October 1945. This annual event was one of the biggest gatherings in the region, drawing thousands of visitors from surrounding areas. Against his mother's wishes, but with his father's encouragement, Elvis entered the talent competition. Vernon helped him stand on a chair to reach the microphone, a callback to his first church performance years earlier. Wearing clean but well-worn clothes, young Elvis sang "Old Shep," the tearjerker, about a boy and his dog that he had performed at school. What made this performance remarkable was not just Elvis's singing, which by all accounts was impressive, but the persona he adopted. Introducing himself as the Hillbilly Cat, Elvis displayed early signs of the stage presence that would later electrify audiences worldwide. Several witnesses later recalled that even as a child he had a unique way of moving while he sang, shifting his weight from foot to foot in a rhythm that seemed to flow naturally from the music. Elvis won 5th place in the competition and received a prize of $5, a significant sum for a boy who rarely had spending money. More importantly, he experienced the thrill of audience approval on a larger scale than ever before. By some accounts, he used part of his winnings to go to the movies, where he was further exposed to the performers and musical styles that would influence his developing artistic vision. The nickname, the Hillbilly Cat, is particularly interesting as it foreshadowed the fusion of country music, often derogatorily called hillbilly music at the time, and black rhythm and blues, with the cat terminology commonly used in early R&B culture, that would become Elvis's revolutionary contribution to American music. Whether 10-year-old Elvis consciously understood this cultural fusion is doubtful, but the seed of his musical destiny seems present even in this childhood nickname. After the contest, Elvis reportedly told his parents he wanted to perform again as soon as possible. Gladys, protective, as always, worried about her son facing public criticism. But Vernon recognized something important had awakened in his son. "The boy's found something he loves," he told neighbors. The fairgrounds where Elvis had his first taste of competition and public acclaim still exist in Tupelo, though the original buildings are gone. Today, a marker commemorates the spot where the future king took one of his first steps toward musical immortality, armed with nothing but a child's voice and an instinct for performance that would soon change the world. From a two-room shack to worldwide fame, Elvis Presley's journey began in the humble soil of Tupelo, Mississippi. Those formative years shaped not just his musical sensibilities, but his complex personality as well. The poor boy who once brought a dead lizard to school and sang alone in a woodland hideaway carried those experiences with him to the stages of Las Vegas and beyond. The king never fully left Tupelo behind. Even at the height of his fame, friends reported that conversations with Elvis often drifted back to those early days, the church singing, the secret hideout, the poverty, and the dreams of something greater. In the most literal sense, Elvis left Tupelo when his family moved to Memphis in 1948. But in a deeper sense, Tupelo never left Elvis. Those who knew him best understood that beneath the jumpsuits and jewelry was still the Mississippi boy who once stood on a chair to reach the microphone, singing his heart out as the Hillbilly Cat for a $5 prize. Perhaps that's why, even decades after his death, fans still make pilgrimages to the tiny house where Elvis was born, seeking to understand the ordinary beginnings that produced such an extraordinary life.